Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. We'll let some people come in, but thank you for joining us. And those just joining, we'll start in just a second. We're just letting everyone find their way in. All right, well, hello, and thank you for attending today. My name is Scott Sinclair. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs here at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Cancer and Careers is a national nonprofit, and we're the only program of its kind dedicated solely to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. We do so via our comprehensive website, free publications in English and Spanish, and career coaching. Additionally, we offer educational seminars targeted at employees of cancer and their colleagues, healthcare providers. And certainly healthcare employees and caregivers can benefit from the information as well. Our West Coast conference is coming up on October 22nd. That's in about 2.5 weeks on Saturday, held virtually on Zoom. We hope that we'll see a lot of you there as well. We'll be talking about navigating work after diagnosis, career shifting, job search, making disclosure decisions, and much more. To stay informed about all of our programs as they're rolled out, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already by visiting cancerandcareers.org, where you can also find all of our programs and publications free of charge. Now, today's webinar, before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is accredited by ANCC, ASWB, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society of Human Resource Management. If you plan on requesting educational credits for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must log in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and the post-test, as well as receiving a passing grade of 80% or higher on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information. The follow-up email will be sent no later than 5 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, October 6th, and certificates will be emailed within 4 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters of this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. We do want to thank our sponsors, Genentech, HSN, and QVC. Cancer and Careers is able to offer this for our 8th year of the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series. This program was created to provide patients and survivors, as well as their care team and employers, with concise, targeted information about the work-related issues that arise after a cancer diagnosis. Additionally, we'd like to recognize Cancer and Careers' year-long sponsors who support all of our core programming and allow us to continue providing all of our resources and services free of charge. Now, solid communication skills are invaluable in many aspects of one's life, whether it's getting information from your doctors and care team to collaborating at work. And this webinar will help you hone those skills among many other things. And to guide you along this afternoon, I'd like to introduce Rachel Becker. Rachel is Deputy Director of Cancer and Careers and one of our in-house social workers. She has been with CAC for 8 years and previously worked as head of client services at Care Planners, as well as in the clinical capacity at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, as well as the Jewish Child Care Association of New York, and completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. At the end of the webinar, we'll be having a question and answer period. Any questions that you would like answered by Rachel, you should be entered into the Q&A box located at the top or the bottom of your screen. Please do not ask questions in the chat box as they might be missed. If you're joining us via phone today, you can press *9, which will alert us of your question. Now, I would like to hand it over to Rachel to get us started. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. We are so happy that all of you could be here today for this second of 2 sessions on communicating effectively. So if you missed the last session, do not panic. You will still be able to follow along with today's conversation, and hopefully we'll walk away with some meaty information to use in your daily life. And then if you want to go back and watch that first part later, you can find it archived on our website. So in this session, we're going to do a brief overview of what effective communication actually is. Then we're going to shift gears towards a more rubber meets the road practical kind of feel, where we will talk about best practices for using social media and other online platforms, as well as tips and techniques for having conversations at work and looking for a new job. And then we'll also spend some time looking at job search through a communications lens. And we're going to start today by doing a quick review of some of the key points from the last webinar, both as a refresher and to help set the stage for anyone who couldn't join us. So communicating is something that most of us do every day to one degree or another. So from that perspective, it's probably fair to say that everyone here has some degree in expertise in communication already. However, there's always room to grow and learn how to be a more effective communicator, particularly because it is so common to experience challenges to communicating well, and it is not always intuitive how to navigate them. So let's start with the question, what is communication? Well, one definition is that it is a process through which information, ideas, and/or emotions are shared between two or more people, and it can occur in a number of ways. It may happen through audible communications, such as spoken words, and it may also involve sounds that are not words, such as nonverbal grunting or sighing, etc. But of course, not all communications are received through our ears. They may be written out or shared using sign language. Our behavior around others and our body language can also convey information or clues about what we're thinking or feeling. And it's also important to note that sometimes our communications happen in a way that are very thought out and deliberate, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we end up sharing information or ideas based on a spur of the moment decision or impulse. And sometimes details get shared with others subconsciously without us even knowing that we're doing it. So what specifically can make communication effective? Well, you'll see some of those core elements listed on this slide, including that effective communication is a two-way street, meaning that it involves both sharing our thoughts and ideas, while also investing energy in receiving and absorbing the ideas that are being shared by whomever else we're communicating with. This means not only being mindful to get across our own perspective in a way that is clear and organized, but also really paying attention to what the other person or people are trying to get across to us and considering what they're bringing to the table in terms of their own perspective or perspectives. Communicating effectively may also involve asking clarifying questions. If you're not entirely sure what the other person or people meant the first time they said something, a clarifying question can help you get on the same page. Expressing gratitude when it's appropriate is also a best practice. You might assume that the person that you're communicating with knows that you're appreciative, but the reality is that usually people don't know what we don't tell them. And simply saying thank you can go a very long way in communicating effectively. Another best practice can be summarizing what was discussed at the end of a conversation, either verbally before you walk away, or written in an email that gets sent around after the fact. And this is because effective communication isn't necessarily limited to being a one-time event. In fact, it is something that should happen regularly so that people remain aligned in understanding as things evolve. Sometimes those regular communications might be a 10-minute check-in. Maybe it's weekly meetings of an hour or more. Maybe it's just a quick exchange on instant message. There's no one right way to do it. But the key is that conversations remain ongoing. In fact, sometimes effective communication very purposely takes place over more than one conversation. Additionally, effective communication incorporates emotional regulation, which means having the goal of staying centered so that what you're feeling doesn't take too much of center stage in how you're expressing yourself. That doesn't mean you want to come across as flat or robot-like, but it does mean keeping regulation on those emotions. Asking for help when you need it is also an essential part of communicating effectively. Every single person on the planet, no matter their health status or their job title or any other personal characteristics, needs help from time to time. So asking for it shouldn't be something you shy away from, particularly at work. And of course, effective communication should result in a clear understanding of any next steps. And this point can be particularly key in a variety of settings, including conversations with your healthcare team. Probably an area where many of you have an expertise already. And you may also know that it can often be helpful to prepare in advance for some conversations that you may be having with your providers in order to make sure that you remember to ask all of the questions that you want answers to in the limited amount of time that you have with them. Similarly, conversation with families or other loved ones may benefit from advanced preparation, such as if you're sharing the news about your diagnosis or updates to your treatment plan. And then these bottom two bullet points really start to ground us in the conversation we're going to have today. It can be really important to think strategically about what you post online, whether on social media or on a blog or anywhere else you might be posting, since our online behaviors can have a real impact on our work lives. Lots more to come on that. And of course, strategic communications can make a big difference in work-related context, whether you are currently employed or looking for a new opportunity, or both. Now, we're going to start digging into the topic of social media. And as we do, I first want to take a moment to talk about some of the good things that social media brings into our lives, because there is so much that we hear in the media today about some of the questionable or dangerous things that social media can bring on. Those are very real. I don't mean to undercut them in any way. If you attended any other Cancer and Careers events, you've most likely also heard us talk about some of the complexities that social media can create in a work arena. We're also going to talk about those a little bit more today. But first, I think it's really important that we acknowledge some of the benefits, because those are very real too. And there wouldn't be a need to talk about potential complexities if so many of us weren't drawn to social media for the benefits. And when it comes to the role that we hear it playing in the lives of people who have received a cancer diagnosis, we have heard so frequently from people that social media has been really helpful in decreasing their feelings of isolation during treatment, after treatment. It's not only helpful for connecting with existing friends and family, but it's a channel for making new connections with people who are living through a similar experience. And having that specific kind of community is often quite powerful. Social media can also be a very efficient tool for creating a curated feed of information related to your experience with cancer. Following multiple support organizations, following reliable health news sources. These are great ways to have, maybe articles about new research or information about resources or webinars like this one, other programs. Those can essentially be delivered directly to you through a well-curated social media feed. Online communications are important from the work perspective as well, in that having a social media presence can be a source for prospective job opportunities. In fact, these days, many recruiters will reach out to potential candidates that they find on LinkedIn, simply because they came across their profiles and they met the stats for what they were looking for. In other words, communicating through online platforms might bring opportunities for jobs to you. It is also the case that many employers believe that their current employees should maintain an appropriate social media profile. And this is true across a variety of industries, from retail to healthcare and beyond. Engaging in communications on social media is also a way to stay relevant in the world of workers. Not only, again, is it a great source for keeping a finger on the pulse of what's going on in your community, but it's also in your professional community, I should say. But it is also a way of exercising skills, knowing what the advances are, because more and more the way that jobs are social media and technology is impacting the way that jobs are being done. So continuing to invest in understanding the online landscape can be beneficial, obviously, if you're looking for a new job, but also if you're working and your organization is continuing to evolve, and you're continuing to evolve as a professional. Now, I mentioned that there are also some complexities associated with communicating online. And it is important to talk about these so that when you're making choices about what you share or post or talk about, you can make informed decisions that you feel good about. Now, specifically, there can be some challenges to maintaining privacy on mainstream social media platforms like Facebook and TikTok and so on. And the underlying reason for this is that these platforms make their money by selling personal information to advertisers. So what you see on this slide is an image that shows the revenue generated by Facebook from 2009 to 2021 by segment. And if you look at that 2021 column all the way on the right side there, you will see, actually you might not see it because the print is very, very tiny in this graphic. So I will just tell you that the revenue in 2021 amounted to 115 billion US dollars. So that is a billion with a B as in beta. And that is a 36.5% increase from what it was in 2020. And when you, of course, you zoom out and look at the whole graphic, you can see that there has been an increase every year in 2009 in terms of revenue. And that is because these platforms are always making new deals to make more money. And they do that by selling our personal information. So yes, Facebook and Twitter's and all of those other platforms have privacy settings, but even if you make your profile as protected as possible, no account is entirely private, and those settings might change depending on what the platform is trying to do to generate revenue. So that underscores why it's important to be strategic about the ways in which you communicate. One very effective step that you can take to protect your privacy before ever even sitting down at a keyboard or opening an app is to develop a personal disclosure plan. This includes making clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer experience you're going to share both online and off. And when we think about the virtual world, where are you going to share in terms of specific websites or blogs? It's also a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. Now, it may be the case that some of you have already disclosed at work and everyone is being really supportive, and that is an outstanding situation to be in. But because the internet doesn't go away, it's important to think beyond right now and consider the possible impact months from now, maybe even years from now, even if at the moment you're in an outstanding situation. Because as much as I sometimes wish it weren't the case, none of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive supervisor may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information they find. Then once you've made those decisions, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people that you're connected to online, and that's the only way that you know them. And then even after you've shared your preferences, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so that you have a sense of what comes up in a search if someone Googles you. Finally, It's key to remember that even if you've passed the moment of initial consideration, you can redefine your disclosure and communication plan and preferences at any time. And while it might not change what's already out there, there can still be value in making new and different choices. Now, if thinking about how exactly to go about building up your professional online brand feels intimidating to you, you are not alone. But it can help to think about doing so as an opportunity to tell the story about who you are as a working person. In other words, by taking a strategic approach to posting, it allows you to be in control of your story. And all of that starts by taking a look at what is already out there. Google yourself, see what comes up. What order does it come up in? You know, if your goal is to put your best self forward for potential employers, does what's up there right now work for you? And if that's not the case, what do you think might work better? Those popular social media sites that we were just talking about, another benefit is that they can be deployed strategically to change how you show up in web searches. We're going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But you also might consider setting up a professional web page or blog so that there's a dedicated online destination that talks only about who you are and what work you've done. We also recommend running each post through a kind of filter by asking yourself questions like the one you see in the gray box. That's a way to be mindful and feel really confident before you click share or post. And this is because while it is possible to delete posts that no longer represent your interest, keep in mind that though they may be harder to find after you delete them, they're still going to be out there somewhere on the internet. So let's go back and talk about the various mainstream social media platforms and how to use them strategically. So as we think about building an online brand, social media sites like LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, they rank very high in Google searches, which means that if you become active on these sites, they're likely to show up at the top of the list of results that someone gets if they Google your name. That said, keep in mind that the different platforms have different audiences. LinkedIn is considered a secondary resume to many employers, so you'll want to keep it up to date. For example, a new certification, or if you wrote a blog related to your field, or if you got a promotion, these are the types of things that you're going to want to share on LinkedIn. The key is to keep it work focused. LinkedIn is not the place to post about the awesome novel that you just read, unless maybe you work in publishing, and so that might be an opportunity for you to speak your professional voice. But for most of us, if we're not in the publishing industry, that's not going to be what we're going to want to talk about. Linked at the bottom of this slide is CAC's archived webinar on building an effective LinkedIn profile, which goes into much, much more detail than we have time for today about how exactly to do that, to build an effective profile. Twitter is another platform that can be deployed strategically to give employers a curated view of your professional self by sharing interesting articles you read, or retweeting thought leaders who you admire, and providing some commentary through your professional lens. Facebook, on the other hand, is not typically the platform where employers are going to go to dig into who you are as a professional. So there's more flexibility to post about your personal interests. However, it is worth noting that employers will sometimes look at Facebook profiles to find out more about who people are on the human level. So it's still wise to be deliberate in what you're posting. Avoid rude comments or profanity or things that might not land so well with somebody who doesn't know you and is considering you in a professional context. Okay, so let's shift now to talking about work-related conversations. And what I'm about to say might feel like it's a bit on the obvious side, but I do want to pause on it for just a second and say that whether you are currently employed or looking for a new work opportunity or both, your communications typically are going to fall into one of two categories. Spoken, and we would consider sign language communications to fall into this category, and also written. And so this slide has examples of each. There may be others that occur to you as well. We're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about these, but first we're going to spend some time talking about spoken communications, because a best practice with these is often to do some planning in advance. Written communications, you can go back and proofread and edit and refine before they go out into the world. For the most part, instant message maybe gets a little tricky with that. But for the most part, you can go back and review before you finalize copy. Spoken communications, you got to do it from the other side. You got to prepare in advance before you speak. So, some ways to go about doing this. Writing out a script or outline of key points to help drive conversation. This is a great way to make sure that you don't leave out key points when you're talking in real time. And also there is a strategic benefit as well, because it allows you to play with the order that you're presenting topics and ideas in. It can help you identify anything that feels redundant so that you're really ultimately coming across more polished and put together in terms of what you're speaking. It can also help to think through potential comments, questions, or topics that might come up and catch you off guard, such as questions about treatment or how you're feeling. And we're going to go through a number of examples of how to plan responses very shortly. Identify and plan to address any boundaries or expectations you may need to set or manage. So we did a whole 60-minute webinar earlier this year on setting boundaries that is archived on our website if you're interested in taking a really deep dive into this topic, although we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about professional boundaries today shortly as well. And then also using friends and family to rehearse work-related conversations before they happen. Social workers can also be a really good resource for doing this. And I think people often underestimate how helpful role-playing can be, or they write it off because the idea feels silly or it makes them feel uncomfortable. And I get that, I really do. But over the years, I have worked with a number of people who have been really, really surprised by how much of a difference it can make to actually practice making the words come out of your mouth while you're interacting with another person. So to anyone whose reflex is to dismiss this idea out of hand, really encourage you to give it a try if you're preparing to have some conversations, particularly some more challenging conversations. So, oops, sorry about that. Okay, now we're going to spend some time getting into the how-tos of planning responses to comments and questions. And we're going to spend the next few slides going through some examples. But first, I do want to flag that these examples reflect the perspective of someone who has disclosed their cancer diagnosis to at least one person in their workplace. However, we know, and as we talked about in the last session, there are people who make the choice not to disclose because that is what is right for them. And that is a valid choice to make. So if that's you, I encourage you to keep in mind that the concepts here can still be used even if you haven't disclosed. So I'd like to go back to that idea of navigating unexpected comments and questions that I brought up quickly on the last slide and tell you about a conversation technique called the Swivel. So the Swivel is a verbal formula or pattern that is used in response to a comment or question that you would prefer not to answer. And it involves acknowledging the comment or question, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented. So for example, you can see the first one on this slide says, someone might say to you, my uncle had cancer, to which you could respond, I'm sorry to hear that. That must have been very hard. And while I have you here, what did you think about the meeting we had yesterday? I'd love to pick your brain about X, Y, and Z. So being able to shift the conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be really empowering. And it indicates to your coworker that you're still a whole, vibrant person with lots of communications to make. And you'll find that a lot of the examples that we're going to go through over the next few slides are built on this Swivel technique. Right. So something I think it's often hard for people to recognize, particularly for those who want to be viewed as a valuable employee, regardless of health issues, is that everyone has limits. And it's important to take the time to figure out what yours are and what triggers them, especially while juggling both work and cancer treatment and recovery. In our personal lives, it may be easy to tell someone that we need space or to be left alone. However, work culture often makes that hard to do, which means it is critical to find productive ways to communicate your limits. Learning to set boundaries on the job might enable you to decline certain types of requests, such as staying late for non-essential tasks or being given new projects to complete. And although it can be difficult to say no, figuring out how to can help you become a better employee. You won't be overburdened with extra work, and you won't feel trapped by every ask you receive. And here are some examples of how to professionally and effectively say no. You'll notice that they involve expressing gratitude and then sharing an explanation that is rooted in being human. These explanations could apply to almost anyone in almost any workplace, rather than giving an explanation that is rooted very specifically in a cancer diagnosis or an experience with treatment. Also flagging that there's a sort of swivel here, because the speaker is saying, I can't right now, and then they're demonstrating a positive character trait, like being conscious of deadlines and timelines, or being excited about future opportunities. So they're not leaving it at the I can't right now. They're saying I can, and also. And again, going to flag role playing here, particularly for those of you out there who are people pleasers. Practicing saying no, specifically if you're a people pleaser and it is not something you're great at, practicing it with people that you are close to and comfortable with can help you to get better at it in work settings. Of course, there are a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace. And the one we have on this slide falls into the category of well-intended, but off-putting. So your boss may say to you, you've been looking so exhausted recently. I didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate. But let's say that how you look doesn't reflect how you feel and you feel fine and you're happy to have work as the distraction. You might swivel by saying, I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. In fact, last night I had some ideas about the project and I'd love to share them with you. Again, the key is finding language that is relevant to your circumstances and that sounds like you. And I guarantee that you will get better at swiveling the more you practice it. Another area around which we've been seeing a lot of dialogue in the cancer community is the use of battle language when discussing the experience of going through treatment for cancer. And I do want to be very explicit in saying that in no way am I implying that using fight metaphors is inherently bad. If it is a concept or language that resonates for you and works for you, but then we are all for that. But we also know that it doesn't work for everyone. And in fact, I've met quite a few people over the years who have found it very upsetting. And that's also valid. And in those circumstances, it can be very jarring when someone else assigns that language to their personal cancer experience. particularly if it's a coworker that the diagnosed person doesn't know all that well. So one of the things that we believe very strongly at CAC is that each person should be in charge of their own narrative and how their story is told. The Swivel is a very important tool in all of that, and this is how you might use it in an instance of battle language. So how can one address it in a workplace if the coworker says something along the lines of, "I so admire how you are battling your cancer. I think that kind of fighting spirit is so critical to defeating it." Well, one approach might be the Swivel and saying something like, "Thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to balance everything that I have going on. While I have you here, the budget recommendations you provided need to be tweaked slightly. Could we set up a meeting to discuss it further?" So this approach drives the conversation back into the realm of work-related topics without having to engage directly with the battle language that was used. Again, this is an example of something that you might not anticipate. You might not anticipate that your coworker is going to come up to you and start using battle language, but if you know that battle language doesn't work for you, this is something you could potentially prepare to address. With all of that said, we know that this approach is going to work for some people, but not for everyone. And others might prefer to take a more direct approach and make it a teachable moment. So saying something like, "Thank you for appreciating how challenging it can be to have everything that I have going on. I understand why you think that mindset and attitude are so important to navigating cancer and life and work. But I do want to share that while for some people the battle language is very inspiring, for me it's actually not. So I would be grateful if we could talk about my experience using less loaded words." Once again, this approach is not going to work for everyone. And if you do decide to take it, it is important to be open to the idea that it may invite further conversation, which requires you to provide further guidance to your coworker. Or it may create a situation where you just leave the person to absorb what you said. Also possible that you'll get another response entirely, but the point is that you're going to want to be comfortable managing whichever reaction you may generate should you take this teaching approach. So the comment we've shared on this slide falls into the category of what we call outright insensitive. And you can see the possible response we have included here is pretty substantive. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave you to read it on your own. But what this slide really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond if someone were to make a comment like this, so that your reply uses language that sounds like you, so that you don't find yourself caught off guard by any emotional reaction you have, and subsequently say something that you wish you hadn't. All right, now let's dig into how to communicate effectively during a job search. We're going to touch on some critical things today. Obviously, we've gone over a lot in this 60-minute webinar. And I want to let you know that the West Coast conference that Scott mentioned earlier, which is happening on October 22nd, is going to, the afternoon is going to be spent with Julie Jansen, who is one of our expert career coaches. We've done a lot of work with her over the years. She's fantastic. And she is going to really guide us to sinking our teeth into some of these topics. We call it the West Coast Conference, but it's virtual, so you can really attend from anywhere within the United States. And registration is still open, so I encourage you to sign up if you'd like to really take a hard dive into job search communications. But for today, we're going to give you an overview and start by saying that clear communication is, as we've mentioned, it's key to opening doors to potential interviews. So whether that's through networking, or in a cover letter, or a well-constructed resume or LinkedIn profile. But all of these modalities involve making the best use possible of a limited amount of space. And in interviews as well, you have a limited amount of time to communicate to the interviewer that you are the savviest and most qualified candidate for the job. And that is a skill that requires practice. So again, in interviews, this is where you would employ some of the advanced preparation and practice. And then for a resume or cover letter or LinkedIn profile, it's about going back and editing and refining and improving. And that can be an endless process that goes on for a long time. What is an effective resume? Well, simply put, it is a written communication that is easy to read and understand. It keeps an effective, specific audience in mind, which means that you might want to use different versions of your resume to apply for different jobs, or if those different jobs require different specific skills. Other critical points. For experienced professionals, no more than 2 pages. For someone who is newer to the job market, you want to keep it to 1 page. Each resume must have a profile or summary at the top. You're going to want to incorporate keywords for scanning software to pick up. Putting in volunteer and community service on your resume is fine. You probably want to leave out personal information. Explain what your job is. Don't just put your job title in there. Job titles don't have universal meanings. So really unpack what your responsibilities were so the reader understands. And then you're going to want to avoid using phrases like effective communicator or detail oriented. Those are considered to be pretty generic. And it's better to focus on keywords and accomplishments and using language that really highlights who you are as a unique individual. I'll also mention that we have a resume review service, which allows you to upload your resume, and we'll pass it along to a career coach who will take a look at it and get it into the best shape possible. Also, our job search toolkit is an outstanding publication, which you can download or order to be delivered to you for free in hard copy. And it has lots of examples of resumes. It also has lots of examples of cover letters. But for now, let's talk about them quickly. And when it comes to cover letters, I think the 2 best pieces of advice are, first, don't just regurgitate your resume. A cover letter is an opportunity to use prose to draw parallels or to highlight an experience that makes you uniquely suited to a particular role. And the second piece of advice, don't use a generic cover letter that doesn't tie you to the specific company or job in question. I have read a lot of cover letters in my day, and I am here to tell you that it is always very clear when someone has submitted a generic cover letter that they've probably also sent to a number of employers. And it is much more appealing when someone has taken the time to really connect the dots and explain to us why they're interested in a specific organization or job. And that's a pretty universal way to make a good impression. So we're going to talk a little bit about building an effective LinkedIn profile, although I do really encourage you to check out the webinar that we have archived on our website if you would like a much meatier look. So you're going to want to write a compelling description of who you are as a worker, so potential employers or contacts are going to want to keep reading your profile. Also, make sure that you have a picture, a clear picture that's recent, that looks like you. And really shows your face clearly. You don't want a group shot. You don't want anything that looks blurry. You want something that really, shows what you look like. Ask for substantive recommendations from people you are already connected with in your network. And when you reach out for those, be specific in terms of what you'd like them to talk about. Hi, Jane, hope you're well. I'm updating my LinkedIn profile. Would love it if you would write me a recommendation that's focused on the XYZ project that we did together. Post status updates regularly so that your profile doesn't become stale. And also joining groups that are relevant to your professional interest and actively participating in them is a great way to breathe life into your presence, and also a great way to network. And speaking of networking, according to a number of sources, about 85% of jobs are found through networking. Networking can happen both online as well as in person, so knowing how to best approach it in either format is important. Now, it's understandable if networking may feel awkward or uncomfortable. In fact, it's pretty common. And a great way to ease some of the anxiety going into these interactions is to have some general questions on a variety of topics to get the conversation flowing. And you'll see a number of examples on this slide. They don't necessarily have to be focused on professional experience. Learning about hobbies and interests and talents, that's a great way to get people more engaged and open. Now, here we've also included a number of best practices for communicating effectively during in-person networking. Now, the first thing is it's important to really do the best you can to remember people's names. And I know how challenging this is. This is challenging for me. It's challenging for a lot of people. But when you introduce to somebody, there are some steps that you can take to try to help commit their name to memory. One trick is to repeat the person's name 2 to 3 times, or to make an association between their name and something or someone else. So for example, if you meet a person and their name is Bruce and they're wearing blue, perhaps you remember them as Blue Shirt Bruce. Or maybe you make a connection to the fact that you love Bruce Lee movies. In fact, you just watched Enter the Dragon last night, and then here is Bruce. Small talk is something that often gets a bad reputation, but it's an important skill when networking. Overall, try to avoid controversial topics that are heavier, such as politics and religion, and stick to more approachable topics, such as the questions that we looked at on the last slide. And then it's also essential to use proper networking etiquette, like sending follow-up emails if you have a more than 15-minute conversation with someone. Try to use the word you more than you use the word I in written communications. And if you tell someone you're going to do something, like send your resume or an article that you discussed, make sure that you do it in a timely manner to ensure that you build on any good first impressions that you generated. Now, when it comes to online networking, one key difference between Facebook and LinkedIn is that it is much more acceptable to reach out to people you haven't met yet. In fact, if you're looking for job opportunities, this is a highly recommended way of networking. That said, if you do reach out to someone you don't know personally, it's important to know exactly what you are asking for in reaching out to them, as most people are willing to help you if you can articulate what it is that you need from them. Also, remember that networking is a reciprocal process. Try to work in the offer to help them out some way in return. And to that end, it makes sense to be strategic about your connections. Reach out to people who it makes sense logically to have as part of your network. And then hopefully once you've deployed some strategic networking, you'll find yourself with some interviews lined up. So in terms of best practices, the key factor to keep in mind is that what is most important to a prospective employer is how the applicant, how you can solve that employer's problems and meet their needs. So you should be prepared to speak about that. Tell stories about how you've solved problems at prior jobs and use specific examples. Also, don't be afraid to make the exchange conversational. One of the things that hiring managers are assessing for is personal fit. So don't shy away from back and forth exchanges that are really going to demonstrate who you are as a unique person. If the interviewer asks you a question you're not quite sure how to answer, don't be afraid to ask those clarifying questions to ensure that you're answering the question that they want you to answer. And also, and this can be absolutely critical, it really can be make or break, you must send a thank you note after every interview to everyone you met with. If you do a group interview, it can be tempting to send a single email that CCs all of your interviewers, but resist that impulse. Sending individual notes to each individual person recognizes their unique contributions to the process, and it leaves a really good impression on the interviewers who are probably also talking to each other. And we have some best practices for communicating effectively during interviews. First is, as we've said before, prepare. Research the company and the interviewer before you meet with them. It's also smart to plan or draft and then practice saying out loud potential answers to potential questions so that when you respond, it sounds polished and comprehensive. Also important to know that the way you communicate in an early stage interview may be different to how you communicate once you've already had 1 or 2 meetings. So in early stage interviews, remember that while your cancer experience may be front and center in your mind, it is unlikely to be front and center in the interviewer's mind. So your primary focus in these moments should be on describing your interest in the job and selling yourself as qualified, personable, confident. In later stage interviews, you'll want to be strategic about, well, you want to be strategic all along the way, but in the later interviews, disclosure. If it feels important for you to disclose as part of the job search process, and again, this is generally not required, but if it feels important to you to do it, you're going to want to feel out a moment where it feels relevant to share this information in a conversation, in an interview style conversation. It's always up to you if you want to share this in an interview process or how you want to share it. We typically recommend staying away from sharing this information in a cover letter or a resume, because there have been some studies done where the researchers found that people who disclose their diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, or a disability of some kind in a cover letter are less likely to get called in for a job. Obviously, we very much wish that this weren't the case. It is not the way the world would be if I were in charge of it. That is for sure. But the reality is that we do know that these things happen. It's very easy to put a resume to the side when you haven't met that person yet and you have a whole other stack of potential candidates. But once you've sat down in the room with someone and they've gotten a sense of who you are, your energy, your personality, if it's really important for you to disclose that information, doing it in that context will often help it to land differently than it would on paper when you haven't actually met the person yet. You're also going to want to be strategic about when you ask about benefits like health insurance and time off, because asking about those too soon can make you look like you're more focused on the extras that come with the job rather than the job itself. So when you're interviewing, the Swivel can also be a very useful tool if a question comes up that touches on your cancer experience. Simply refocusing the conversation can help to put the recruiter or interviewer at ease and get the conversation back on the right track. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read through all of these. There are some examples on the next slide as well, which is why I say all of these. But the key with these swivels is to be future focused, stay non-specific, be brief. You want to make sure that the answer acknowledges the question that was asked, and then it swivels the interviewer's attention back to the job itself and to the desire to get hired and the skill set that is on the table. And so again, you've got 2 examples on this slide about how you might answer a question about gaps on your resume. You'll notice that again, these are general responses. They don't specifically mention cancer. We've also got two other questions and examples on this slide as well of things that might come up in interviews. So we're almost to the question and answer portion. Before I turn it over to Scott to lead us into that, I want to mention that we have a couple of slides at the end of this deck that include tools and resources that can help you in continuing to think about communicating effectively. So we've broken them into 3 groups. This slide talks about, has links to articles and resources that talk about online disclosure and posting. This slide talks about tools, has links to tools for communicating on a job if you're currently employed. These are some tips for people who are looking for work. Again, I mentioned the West Coast Conference earlier. There's going to be a whole afternoon of conversation about things along these lines. So if that's you, please sign up for the West Coast Conference as well. And that leads us to our top takeaways for today. The first is that online communication considerations are important. Understanding techniques to approaching conversations can help you remain in control. And many aspects of the job search can benefit from effective communications in both spoken and written formats. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to lead us into question and answer.
Thank you so much. That was great, Rachel. Before we start the Q&A, I just want to go over a few quick things. I'm going to take control back from you, Rachel, so I can move this along. And all of these resources are in the deck that was emailed to everybody beforehand if you want it for later. So there's a few upcoming events. We have 2 more webinar series left for the year. The next one will be on November 2nd, which is balancing remote work and cancer. And then we're finishing the year off on December 7th with balancing work and caregiving. So if you have people in your life who have acted as a caregiver or currently acting as a caregiver and you want to pass that along to them, please do so. And then, as we've talked about, we have our West Coast conference on Saturday, October 22nd. All of these you can find on our website or the link in the deck that you have in your email. Now, if we want to open it up to some questions, the first one I have here is, I was recently diagnosed with cancer and have been away from the office while recovering from surgery. How do I handle email inquiries from my supervisor asking, how are you doing? I trust that they care about how I'm doing, but I also think they're wondering about when I'll be able to return to work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can really appreciate the duality of that, of seeing the humanness that drives that question, but also the concerns about work. And I think, well, I mean, the first question that comes up for me is, what format are these happening in? Are they texting you? Are they calling you? Because that's gonna, there's gonna be some nuance depending on all of that. But this is a moment where I think using the Swivel and starting broadly can be really helpful. Like, you might say something along the lines of, one step at a time, and how are things going with XYZ project, right? So there's no requirement for you to talk about it. And I think often as people, when we're going through these health issues, and it's so front and center and so present in our mind, and we are healing from a surgery and feeling vulnerable, we're so used to thinking about it or talking about it with our loved ones, talking about it with our family. We kind of feel like, well, that's what I do now. I talk about it. But it doesn't have to be the case. And so remembering that, you can just say, we're just taking it day by day. Hey, how's this project at work? You could say, if this is someone you have a personal relationship with, how's your kid? How's your dog? Did you, have you watched the new season of whatever series on Netflix you guys watch together, right? There are ways to acknowledge the question, keep the conversation going, and leave the when are you going to return to work bit of it out of the conversation until such time that it needs to become relevant, because they really shouldn't be checking in on you like that.
And I feel like
on a regular basis.
We've all had that experience of trying to be helpful and checking in on our friends when they are sick or distracted or whatever the issue may be. So so much of it is coming from a place of love and care, not realizing that you might be inundated with everybody in your life asking you the same questions, or the tone that's being asked, and keeping all of that in mind as well, I think is kind of grounding.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think it's also the case that, like, another point that I want to make here that I think is really important too is that, particularly if this is coming in as a text message kind of thing, we don't necessarily know what's on the person's mind. And sometimes when it's coming from an employer and we're taking time away, we might feel some degree of guilt for whatever reason. And whether that's the right thing for us to feel or not, like that's not important. Sometimes we feel guilt in those moments. And so we might read into it that they're saying, hey, implying like, when are you coming back? It may really just be that they're saying, how are you doing? We don't know. We don't know one way or another necessarily. And so if you've been asked a question and you've been asked to put an answer out there, put out an answer that's going to keep you in a lane that you're comfortable with, and it can have absolutely nothing to do with your health.
Yeah. The next question we have here, how do I reply to comments from other people saying, well, if you're going to have cancer, this is the best to have, or at least they caught it early. I know folks are trying to be helpful, but feels dismissive of how serious cancer feels sometimes.
Yeah, I feel that one too. That's always tough. You know, we live in a society where people often really struggle to have conversations with somebody who has who's having some sort of experience with their health, and it has to do with their own anxiety. Maybe they're not sure how to talk about it. Maybe they're coming to the table with some experience, and so, you know, it's kind of bringing up something in their past, which is never the point, right? If you're gonna talk to somebody who's sick about the sickness that they have, like, focus the conversation on the person that's in front of you and that you're talking to. But I digress. We don't live in a perfect world. So, you know, I think that this to me really speaks to the battle language slide that we talked about earlier, where you have some choices. You can swivel right out of that one and say, you know, thanks, I appreciate the optimistic perspective and blah, 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 blah. Or, you know, and just turn the conversation to another place, again, something work related. You know, the Netflix series that you watch together, it doesn't have to be work related. Swiveling is a life skill. It is not just a job skill. And of course, the other choice is to have like a face-to-face moment of honesty and say, you know what, I know that you mean well. I really know that you do. But let me tell you why what you just said is actually something that's hard for me to hear. And, you know, that's something that can be challenging for us to say as well, is like, hey, you made me uncomfortable. I know you didn't mean to, but you made me uncomfortable. And you might say, you know, I appreciate that you're trying to put a positive spin on it, but it actually helps me not to think about it in those terms. And I'm going to just look at what you wrote for a second so I can see the specific phrasing that you've used. So, well, if you're going to have cancer, this is the best one to have. You know, you might say that's really complicated for me because, you know, even if that's true, it still really sucks. And it doesn't, I know you're trying to help me and I know you're trying to show me the best, but I kind of need people who are going to just sit with me in the fact that it sucks. Because there's no benefit.
Chemo's horrible no matter what tumor type you have.
I mean, well, for some people it's not. Some people have almost no side effects, and I have met those people in my time, and they're very, very fortunate. But the reality is that if that is not the experience you are having, right? If you are having a bad time, you are having a bad time, and it doesn't matter if it's the best one to have. You can still have a bad time with the Cadillac of cancers, which is maybe my least favorite phrase that I've heard in my time working for a variety of reasons. So I would say that, you know, with the, at least they caught it early, you might say, you know, you're right, they did catch it early and that's good, but there are still a lot of unknowns. And for me, you know, I appreciate you wanting to put a big spin on it, but given all of the unknowns, it's hard for me to think about it in those terms, so I prefer not to. You know, and chances are, if you call someone out on that, they will probably say, you know what, thank you for telling me. There will probably be some, maybe they'll feel a little awkward, maybe they'll get quiet for a second, maybe they'll have to walk away and process it for a second. But the greater likelihood is at the end of the day, they will appreciate that you told them what works for you. And I would even argue that there's a likelihood that it will bring you closer in a way, because you'll have navigated a difficult moment and stuck the landing. So that's my thinking on that.
I mean, I've been in that position where saying something that I thought was helpful or meaningful and been called out on it because of things that I don't realize in my personal life. And it can be embarrassing, it can be awkward, it can be frustrating. You can want to do a, but I meant that, you know, and dig yourself into a hole, but you walk away and then the next day you think, I'm so glad that that happened. And now I understand where they're coming from. I feel like you just said you can be closer, you can have deeper conversations once you kind of get into that reality of things.
Yeah. You know, and it's really interesting, Scott, because we hear so often about people having anxiety that they're going to say the wrong thing, but then we're also hearing examples of anxiety where other people are saying the wrong thing too. So it really just goes to show you, like, there's kind of a perspective into both sides of the equation there, you know, that by and large, everybody really just wants to be communicating in the best way possible. And sometimes you're going to be able to do that effortlessly. Sometimes you're going to be able to do it with planning. Sometimes you're going to fall a little bit short and you're going to have to, you know, do a little bit of a dance to get back to the right place. But if your goal is to communicate effectively and communicate well, you can probably make that happen.
I agree. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There are a few more questions here. If we didn't get to your question, please shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we will be happy to give you a personalized answer for everything that you have. In terms, oops, I went too far. Well,
hang on, I got you. Just a second.
We want to thank
That's
everybody.
What you wanted, right?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We want to thank everyone for coming. Like we said earlier, you'll be getting an evaluation in your email tomorrow. We'd really appreciate if you fill that out. It helps us, your feedback helps us design this program and topics that we're talking about. And if you are requesting CEs, you'll also get the post-test in there as well. And again, if you have any questions, cancerandcareers@cew.org. We have people who will reach out to you one-on-one to help you with anything you need. So Rachel, thank you again for your brilliant points and information. And thank you for everybody for coming. And we hope to see you next month.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Bye.